Hello and welcome. It's day 90 of the lockdown of South Africa to try to combat the devastation that has not been seen by anyone, including myself and my white hair, without a shred of doubt. So now it's crunch time. While we were locked down, of course, nothing was happening on many fronts on the economic front. And as a result, there are many holes to fill. I'm reminded of that saying when you get to London for the first time and you are not used to getting onto their trams and you hear this guy go, "Mind the gap." I'm sure that's the song that's going on in Tito Mboweni's head right now. Well, he is coming through today and going to talk to us about what he is going to do to try to find the money that he doesn't have. Welcome to this special coverage of the ministry's budget here on CNBC Africa. I'm Godfrey Mutizwa. In the next 2 hours, we shall know what the minister thinks and how he's going to try to find the answers that he requires. In short, the finance minister has to find 130 billion rand from his ministries to make up part of the 500 billion rand stimulus package that the president has promised he is going to unlock to try to combat the COVID-19 pandemic. The minister will be speaking at about 3 p.m. and in between there, we shall be talking about what he is going to be talking about. To help me, as part of that discussion, let me introduce my co-guest this afternoon. I have Annabel Bishop, Chief Economist at Investec, and double teaming with me on her is Fifi Peters, my colleague who joins us virtually, like everybody else these days, from wherever she is in Johannesburg. Fifi, I'm not going to give you away. Welcome, everybody, and thank you for your time. Annabel, can I start with you? I want to understand precisely the number that the minister wants to find or needs to find before we discuss what he is going to do to find it.
So it's 130 billion that we have heard before that's been announced that will be looking to reallocate. So basically was previously allocated to other areas of expenditure and is going to be looking to shift it now. Of course, as well, Godfrey, don't forget, substantial bond issuance has already occurred. We're at about $1 billion a day. And of course, the risk that we see even further.
Right. So partly he has funded that missing money by going to the market and borrowing, right?
And, we certainly don't expect any tax increase this budget, given the extreme damage that's been done to the economy. We're likely to see a GDP contraction of about 10% this year. So very much bond issuance. South Africa living on debt, as you said, Godfrey. And of course, the minister speaking at NEDLAC apparently at the end of last week, saying that, originally debt as a percentage of GDP was supposed to be about 66% this year. Now it's going to be about 80% of GDP.
Give us your ideas in terms of how you see him funding this gap.
Well, certainly the substantial bond issuance is something which they have signaled that is underway, and I think they probably will see an increase in it. Sadly, we're probably going to see a revenue undershoot, a less revenue collected than expected this year of about 300 billion. And of course, that also then brings into mind a huge hole that needs to be plugged. And of course, as I said, likely an increase in bond issuance. We're only probably going to get about $4.2 trillion. Sorry, 4.2 billion. Trillion would be lovely. $4.2 billion from the
I
IMF.
want to give him $4.2 trillion. Really
That'll
do.
be so amazing. And so $4.2 billion. And, that's not going to help very much. But that's one of the areas being used to plug the gap, and possibly more borrowing from multilaterals as well, whether it's, the World Bank, etc. But, mainly I think the big issues are reallocation, as we said, 130 billion, and of course, bond issuance.
Fifi, what have you been hearing?
When you were talking about minding the gap, it reminded me of a tweet that I did see from the minister's account at the weekend, Godfrey. He tweeted a hippopotamus with a hippopotamus's mouth open very wide, and he likened the gap between revenue and expenditure to that of the hippopotamus, and closing it was a Herculean task. I've actually been trying to practice that word, but in a nutshell, it is very difficult, according to the minister, to close a hippo's mouth once it is open. So shortly after that, I tried to look for the tweets on Saturday, Godfrey, and I saw that it was removed. And I don't know if it was as a result of perhaps a counsel from upper echelons for the minister to not have tweeted that, because it was quite a strong indication and a strong message just how difficult a rope he would be walking on this time around. bound. I don't know if you also saw on social media, which is now our breaking news portal, Godfrey. Yesterday, there was an indication that the budget was actually leaked. A lot of questions as to, how did this happen? Where did this happen? Who did it? Who got the budget? I mean, we're living in this time of technology, right? Doing everything virtually. And there was, speculation that the budget was leaked. I haven't seen it. I'm wondering if Annabel has seen it. In fact, I'm wondering if the markets have seen it, because of course, going into this budget, we are seeing quite a firming of the rand. It has been range bound at around the 1730, 1740 levels for the past week, but it is looking a little bit comfortable, and I'm wondering if perhaps a few guys in the market have seen that. Of course, wouldn't be something that they would be announcing, but nonetheless, Annabel, I want to talk to you about some of the data that we are going into this budget with, because at the weekend as well, we did hear from National Treasury confirming that it had been approved to receive some monies from the New Development Bank, $1 billion, I believe it was. And I'm just wondering how much comfort this does provide for the economy and for the investment community, that at least we are being approved by some lenders to get funding to help our budget and, of course, COVID-19.
We do have the debt figures apparently, and also apparently the fiscal deficit figure. The fiscal deficit is expected to be around 14% this year. He said we've got 15%, so quite close to that. And of course, as well, the debt, a big worry that it's going to be 80% of GDP this year, likely to rise. And this is the data that's been leaked, as you said, to 91% by 2023, and indeed over 100% by 2025, and climbing to a massive 114% of GDP by 2029, so larger than the size of our gross domestic product. And one obviously feels, how on earth will we fund this? You talked about the market strengthening, and a slight bit of positives. Not always possible to see exactly what the reason for the move in the currency is, and necessarily whether the budget has actually been leaked or not. Whether the figures are out there. But of course, the finance minister has talked about re-looking at the budget from a zero cost perspective, starting again in terms of reallocating the monies. And the biggest issue that the markets will probably be looking for is whether they go ahead with this 160 billion cut in civil service expenditure, which has, as both of you know, has been signaled over the next 3 years.
Yeah, I want to come back to that, Annabel. I want to talk about that 160 billion rand and the civil servants who are going to court to try to make sure they get their money, never mind the pandemic. But I also want to talk about this zero budgeting thing that the minister is proposing, and his ability to be able to pass that through the, I was going to say, the hippopotamus or whatever that you call that thing, but I won't say that because I might be shot. First, let's get in some more voices. Now, one of the questions in this budget is Tito going to touch taxes? Annabel says he is not going to touch taxes. However, in 2018, the government did put up the value-added tax, very controversial at the time, the first time it had done so in 20 years. So the question this time is, will Tito tinker with tax? Well, this is what economist Azar Jamin had to say.
Tito Mboweni is rarely worried about speaking his mind, and has done so many times since he became Finance Minister back in 2018. This is one of the latest and most telling posts on Twitter. I don't remember where this was captured, but if loneliness was a person, this. Certainly, Mboweni goes into this afternoon's emergency budget speech very much alone and ready to speak his mind. It is the worst of times when South Africa's economy is suffering. The economy is expected to contract by as much as 7% this year, with more than 1 million people expected to lose their jobs. In the last week, the Finance Minister has told the National Council of Provinces that unless South Africa stops its spending ways, it could face a sovereign debt crisis by 2024 and end up going cap in hand to the International Monetary Fund. Mboweni needs to carry out a very difficult balancing act with the budget this afternoon. He certainly has less money to play with. Tax collections are likely to fall by 285 billion rand this year because of COVID-19, according to the South African Revenue Service. With little money, he has to decide what to do about the failing state-owned enterprises. He doesn't want more bailouts. On the other hand, the politicians say they can't abandon big names like SAA. Mboweni has to work out how he can keep the economy going in the face of COVID-19 and also make changes to promote growth. At the same time, he needs to address rising debt and present a credible plan for fiscal consolidation. It will be interesting indeed to see any tweets Tito Mboweni comes up with at the end of this testing week. Chris Bishop, CNBC Africa.
I was going to say Chris Azar Jamin Bishop because I mangled up that one. No, that wasn't Azar. Azar, however, is coming up next.
My view is that he probably won't do so because, tax adjustments are the amount of extra money that they'll bring in is minute in comparison with the kind of revenue hole that we have. Take, for example, a 1% hike in the rate of VAT. That would bring in anywhere between 20 and 24 billion rand extra. Well, when you're talking about a shortfall in revenue of 300 to 400 billion rand, that's a drop in the ocean. The same thing if you introduced an increase in personal tax of, say, a once-off increase of, or a once-off imposition of a surcharge of, say, 3% or 5% on personal tax. Again, the amount of additional revenue that you're going to collect is minute compared with the magnitude of the shortfall that we're talking about. And introducing tax increases of those kinds are simply going to be counterproductive because they will go against bringing about a revival in the economy. Far more important, if you really want to bring about a revival in the economy, is finding ways of getting the money that has already been earmarked for rescue to the people that need it. I'm getting very depressed by reading all these reports about the fact that the UIF scheme is not dishing out the money that it's supposed to be doing, that the 200 billion rand loan guarantee through the banking system is not reaching small businesses, and that unemployed persons who can gain 350 rand a month through a special new grant, those who can't access social grants, they're also not managing to access that funding.
Well, that was Chief Economist of Econometrics, Dr. Azar Jamin, there giving us his thoughts of what he's expecting from the budget. And of course, we still have Annabel Bishop with us, the Chief Economist of Investec. And Annabel, just going back to, where we could be getting some money here, or where National Treasury could be getting some money. I think about a month ago, that is when the minister had announced that they were talking with the IMF, I think, as well as the World Bank. And you did mention that $4.2 billion that they were possibly negotiating. And I'm just wondering if you are concerned that those talks are taking longer than they should be. And I say this against the context that we are seeing our peers. Rwanda, I think they've received their second approval from the IMF in terms of COVID-19 related funding. And I'm just wondering what's the holdup with South Africa in your view?
Have taken longer than they should have, or are taking longer than they should have. Both the IMF loan, as you mentioned, and of course also as well the loan guarantee scheme that took a long time to get off the ground in South Africa, and we can talk about that just now and some of the issues around it. But I think for the IMF in South Africa, I would say some of the backlog is certainly South African related. I'd say there's a political opposition to it. The IMF loan certainly, perhaps two different types of loans. One, which obviously is really in the face of COVID-19 to assist on health and expenditure in that regard. The other one is straight IMF loan to help in terms of government finances when you obviously are running into huge fiscal deterioration as we have. Now, the governing party, Tripartite Alliance, is very opposed to that second type of loan. But certainly the first type of loan, the 4.2 billion from the IMF, you would expect that, as you said, to have gone through very much quicker. But I think there probably is some degree of political opposition. And of course, the IMF itself as well, likely to have certain requirements. And if South Africa is not willing to abide by those, that will also cause delays or perhaps not even allow the loan to actualize.
Yeah. Annabel, one of the surprises for me was that there was this $1 billion loan that came through from the New Development Bank. I was surprised by that because I remember when the New Development Bank was launched, this was seen as the panacea to South Africa's one, currency problems, and secondly, foreign exchange reserves problems as well, because this was supposed to be our backstop, if you like, in terms of sorting out any volatility within the markets. And here we are in an emergency. It's $1 billion. Why is it not $5 billion?
Look, I think certainly, any dislocation in the markets and upset in the financial markets is rather sorted out by the South African Reserve Bank. And we saw that with the South African Reserve Bank substantial bond buying program, which they've embarked on. And of course, that then did resolve the dislocation in the bond market and indeed also helped the rand as well. And we've seen substantial foreign investor buying as a consequence. Godfrey, the most important thing in this debate is there an appetite for this huge amount of government debt that's being issued? And currently there is domestically, even internationally, but given the pace and the substantial degree of which they are issuing and will likely continue to issue, there's the risk that we could actually see appetite drying up, particularly if we get more credit rating downgrades. And the budget figures, which Fifi and I were talking about, that potentially have been leaked, really do indicate that there is this huge risk of government debt, roaring out of control, a debt trap, and of course credit rating downgrades. So I think there's very little the new development bank can actually do in the face of this. And the reality of the situation is we actually need to see the debt projections wound back. Perhaps, as Fifi said, even more of the budget's been released, and maybe the debt projections are not so dire. We don't know. But, in terms of the new development bank, well, South Africa is touted to be a developmental state, certainly by government. And, that certainly is the area which the new development bank needs to look into, not necessarily funding government itself. Ultimately, the money needs to come from somewhere. And, the reality of the situation is the bond buying program we've seen from the South African Reserve Bank is not quantitative easing, because they are pulling out money in the short end of the curve. But nevertheless, it has been done to boost liquidity measures. And that's, that's really who solves market dislocations and problems in the market is, your financial markets as your reserve bank.
And well, let's go back to that loan guarantee scheme that you were talking about, 100 billion rand initially, and it can go up as much as 200 billion. So we're talking about a 500 billion rand stimulus plan. 130 billion is expected to come from reprioritizing government expenditure from departments that don't quite need it right now. And then there was this 200 billion rand that is also part of that stimulus package that is for companies who have been hard hit by COVID-19 to provide some form of working capital for them to get themselves off the ground. Of course, we have seen uptake of this loan has been very slow, and for a number of reasons. Some people say that it was, too big of a loan that came too late. It came around 2 months or so into our lockdown. Some are saying that the T's and C's that are attached to that loan for small businesses to lend are just too onerous, and therefore they're walking away, and some are even making the difficult decision of choosing to close shop. I'm just interested in the economic implications then of this slow uptake of this guarantee scheme, and whether there are any opportunities then. I mean, if businesses don't want to take up the loan at this stage, can we not use that money to fund other parts of government?
Yeah. Before you come in, Annabel, one little second. I was going to add that maybe part of the reason why businesses are not taking this up is because they are going back to shareholders. Have you seen the number of rights issues that has been coming through the JSE?
So this loan is not
but
for
this is small businesses,
publicly listed
small
companies.
Businesses.
It's not for those ones, Godfrey. So basically, it's for businesses that are smaller than 300 million. It's not for businesses that are listed on the JSE. It's for small proprietors. It's certainly not for state-owned entities either. So it really is just to try and help, as Fifi was saying, the small and medium enterprises and the micro enterprises in South Africa. And the big issue, Fifi, as you quite rightly say, is that there's been incredibly small take-up. Less than 2% of what was anticipated. And then key point to remember about that this is part of government's fiscal stimulus package, done in conjunction with the South African banking system. Now, the money is not necessarily there to be picked up, if you will, in a lump sum and moved around. Essentially is basically saying that the banking system will look at companies. Some of the qualifying criteria is that the corporates, these tiny little companies, perhaps, corporates might not even be the best word to use now. These little tiny businesses, some of them only have, 10 million turnover or less. They are obviously finding themselves in difficulties, but in order to qualify, they need to be in financial distress. So basically, it's a reactive solution. It's not a proactive solution. It doesn't provide stimulus to the economy. If it actually provided monies to business, they could apply to it, so they could use it to stimulate the economic activity, then you probably would have seen much greater take-up. When a business is already in financial difficulties, and then it's got to, as you said, spend a lot of time complying with terms and conditions, and it's a lengthy, tedious process. A lot of these companies have gone out of business, but indeed a lot of companies even look at the onerous requirements, because the banking system still obviously has not made much leeway on these requirements. They're still applying very onerous credit rating requirements, and the small business might just instead choose just to go out of business or look for small bridging loans elsewhere. Hasn't been a success because it's been far too difficult, because it's been reactive instead of proactive. It doesn't provide stimulus. It's already been aimed at saving something. Because it's come so late and been so slow, it's just taken too long. So instead, a different approach would have been better, and certainly allowing businesses who feel they may go into financial distress in the future and are battling then to apply for that loan. That'll be a true stimulus. But at the moment, if anything, you could actually just term it a rescue package, but one that is failing because the companies are already in such dire financial distress. When they do finally, manage to get to the point of being able to use it, that the banking criteria probably will fail them anyway, qualifying.
Yeah. I'm a wise man. I'm not going to take on two ladies and I think I'm going to win. So I'm going to move on swiftly and talk about Tito and prioritization of spending within the budget. So this is a critical budget for the minister, Annabel. I want to make the point, because this is a minister who came on the back of a reputation of being able to get things done. Here we are. I think this is his second year now, and he doesn't have any more capital to give. We doubted when he came up with that budget in February about his ability to convince the unions not to take up the increases that we're talking about. Have you seen any evidence suggesting that the minister will be able to successfully renegotiate with the unions and get the money that he's requiring?
I think there are probably two parts to this. The one factor is that those in the private sector are going to see lower remuneration this year than they did last year. They're not going to see inflation-adjusted increases typically, or above inflation-adjusted increases, or bonuses or other forms of income. That they're likely to see lower levels than last year. And the unions obviously were requiring from their demands above inflation increases, asking for bonuses, asking for natural salary progressions. These are all, sticking in the face of the crisis, and they're not being sympathetic. Government talks about a social compact between communities and government, and between the public service sector as well as the private sector. And, if you're going to be spending your money on the civil service and giving them a huge amount of largesse and luxury in the face of a dire crisis where many people are really battling financially and collapsing, you're going about it the wrong way. And the second point I wanted to make is in terms of a zero-based budget. You start at zero and you reallocate. You say we have a much smaller amount of money, and we're going to be reallocating on a much smaller amount of money going forwards. Perhaps that's what's been leaked, and maybe that's why markets have perked up. Who knows if it actually has been leaked? But the reality of the situation is it's unsustainable to see such continuous, enormous, and really luxurious salary and wage increases for civil servants. And that's an area where we can cut back. 160 billion to cut back on in the next 3 years would make a difference, because we are borrowing money to actually pay for civil servant salaries and wages. And this is the biggest concern that we have. Borrowing money to pay for civil servant salary and wages, current expenditure pushes you deeper into a debt trap.
No, agreed, Annabel. But I mean, if we just take a throwback to some of the reports that we have read from the ratings agencies regarding the success of the minister in actioning the savings from increasing public sector wages, they're not confident, and that's exactly why Moody's, or one of the reasons why Moody's ended up downgrading us to junk status after the February budget. But Annabel, of course, yesterday we had a very important infrastructure symposium that was held here in South Africa, and I do understand that what was presented by the government was 55 bankable projects, and I'm just wondering what kind of comfort this also provides, that you've got investors who are interested in putting some money in South Africa's economy, and this could be an avenue in which we could get a bit of breathing room to fix our issues. What's your view?
Absolutely, Fifi. And part of the reason that Moody's gave us a downgrade was our inability at the last budget in February this year to actually cut back on the civil service expenditure. None of us are holding our breath to see it actually will come to be. But the reality of the situation, it's necessary for South Africa to be successful, or we're going to find ourselves in a couple of years' time without anyone taking up the endless issuance of government debt that we're putting out there because our credit ratings have fallen so dramatically. You know, we're on the cusp now of falling into single B grade from Standard & Poor's. After that is C grade, which is just, you know, one category before D for default. So you're going to find your interest rates are going to rise much higher. Your bond yields, your long-term interest rates will rise, and the Reserve Bank won't be able to continue suppressing them by quantitative easing because of the reality of the situation, the legislation that requires it to have a limitation on the amount of government debt it can own, and also because of SADC membership rules as well that limit the amount of government debt that the South African Reserve Bank can own. So, you know, turning to a bit of bright news, a bit of happy news on this conversation is certainly, you know, around about 55 bankable projects you said. And I think this is really, really key. You know, South Africa is really focusing on prescribed versus voluntary assets when it comes to infrastructure from a government perspective, but also in terms from a private sector as well. Yes, I think South Africa will always be a good investment opportunity, unless, of course, we move into those dire credit rating and lack of investor appetite, you know, down case I mentioned just now. And that obviously then does provide some positivity for growth. But again, government needs to go about it the right way. You know, we can't have huge amounts of government intervention, state control. We need to actually have a reality where the private sector can actually invest, and we can't have government controlling the funds. The private sector needs to be paid quickly and rapidly for all the work that it does for it to ensure a success. That is what happened in the 2000s under the Thabo Mbeki administration, where we saw economic growth rise to about 5% on a sustainable basis, and unemployment dropped down from 30 all the way down to 21%, and that's what needs to happen again. If you've got huge amount of interference from government in the system, delaying payments to the private sector for infrastructure, from a government perspective, that's going to clog up the system. From a private sector perspective, it'll depend, you know, where these projects come in. Of course, we can do a lot better on the mining side in terms of the costs it takes for investors to come in, but even in terms of, you know, general investment to other sectors, again, it depends very much on our ease of doing business. So we need to obviously improve our electricity capacity and lift a number of other factors as well to really be able to benefit from this investor interest that you're talking about.
Yeah, so I attended that symposium yesterday as well. And one of the things that I picked up is what appears to be more coordination and working together between the private sector and the government. One line that I picked up from the president's statement was that there was going to be a process that standardizes negotiations of contracts, in particular for these complex projects that's going to apply to all the projects that the government is going to be pursuing. Let's see if that does come to be. Fifi, I wanted to ask you a question. From your political economy friends, are you getting any idea whether the minister's suggestion of zero budgeting is picking up opposition, support, or indifference?
I must say, Godfrey, I tend to move more with the investment professionals in the market and stay away from the political minds, expert minds, which I cannot keep up with. But you look at a headline come out today regarding SAA and the restructuring there, and the urging of government for all creditors and everyone involved to accept the restructuring plan for SAA that has been put on the table. And of course, that plan involving quite a lot of job losses. So when you look at it from an SOE point of view and you think, you know, will unions be okay with starting from zero and potentially certain departments getting a lot less, and as a result, certain departments being able to give a lot less to certain entities that employ a lot? I don't know, but I must say, I think unions themselves have also come to the party a bit. I say that at the risk of being unpopular, but they are aware of the economic difficulties that we are currently living in. And I think the issue is the fact that this last decade, as it were, where corruption and billions was looted from the state system, and it was at the top level. And the argument as to why should us as workers have to pay for bad decisions and decisions in which we didn't benefit from. So that is a tricky one regarding the zero budgeting and whether this will be approved. And I suppose that this is a question that we can put to the minister during the press briefing that will follow the budget later on, Godfrey.
Absolutely. I don't know about the unions and your faith in them, because I saw what happened at SAA. I think it was October, November last year when they were demanding bonuses and salary increases, and we know what happened to SAA. We have seen the same thing at the SABC, and we're repeating the same story again with the unions and the government. Well, I could well be wrong. Annabel, before we go, your macro numbers, please. The budget deficit, the big numbers, please give us to them so that we compare when you come back whether you were right or wrong.
We're looking for a fiscal deficit for the 2021 year of 15%. Moving into the 21-22 year, we're looking for 13.5, and then the following year after that, about 12%. We're looking for government debt to rise to about 80% of GDP for this 2021 year, and indeed to 90% by the end of that period, that 2023 period I mentioned. Oh, sorry,
Absolutely.
and lastly, GDP growth. We're looking for GDP growth of minus 10% for this year. And of course, government's likely to be anywhere between -7 and closer to our figures of -10, if not worse.
Absolutely. So you are looking at the worst case scenario, because the other numbers I've seen for the 2020 growth figure is around 7%. And that, I think that's the government figure, right?
Well, the Tito Mboweni said anywhere between, -7 and up to 16%. So who knows at this point, because, you really can't be certain in terms of what the outcome will be. But we've got about, -10, because we believe the recovery will be much slower than expected. And
Yeah.
indeed, we are already seeing a lot of electricity constraints coming through now with absolutely decimated, falling GDP growth. Who knows what's going to happen in the second half of the year when we're supposed to be having fast economic growth? Electricity production still just cannot keep up.
Yeah, of course, we are waiting for the minister to appear in Parliament, well, virtually. Is going to do it virtually, right, Fifi?
Yes, he's going to do it virtually. Our favorite minister, who's really up to date with all social media platforms. We have seen him, and we are waiting for a virtual briefing. But of course, that is also to comply with the social distancing rules that are underway here in South Africa to ensure the minimizing of the spread of the coronavirus. So that's also National Treasury being responsible, as it were. Annabel, I just have one last question for you, and it's just that, of course, this coronavirus is not something that is hitting South Africa alone. It is hitting the balance sheets and the economies of the entire world. And I'm just wondering, as a result of everyone suffering at the same time, okay, to a degree, more suffering a lot than others, and South Africa being a prime example, given that we went into this crisis in a crisis already. But I'm just wondering if the investment community will cut South Africa a little bit more slack, and more so the ratings agencies. You mentioned the ratings agencies will cut South Africa a little bit more slack, given the environment right now that in terms of the pandemic was beyond our control.
And Fifi, you talked an interesting point, because I saw some research from Standard & Poor's recently saying over 30 companies have, dropped from investment to sub-investment grade. Corporates, companies, not countries. But, the primary function of credit rating agencies is to assess your ability to repay your debt. And sadly, I don't think they're going to give us leeway, even though it's happening across the globe and everyone's battling, because they need to merely assess whether or not you have more or less ability to repay your debt. And if we are increasing your debt at a phenomenal quantum like South Africa is, and looking to reach 100% by 5 years time, you're not increasing your ability to repay your debt. You're severely decreasing your ability to repay your debt. And the credit rating agencies don't want to be caught out. They want to make sure that they rate you appropriately. We can't be an investment grade country anymore if, as an emerging market, our debt trajectory is now escalating, as I said, towards 114% by 229. So sadly, they're probably not going to cut us any slack. From an investment community perspective, well, investors will be driven by something else. They will be driven by profit. And of course, from a yield-seeking perspective, South Africa's government bonds offer really great, returns, given that interest rates in the United States are at zero, and other, key advanced economies where you can borrow your money at. Putting it in South Africa, if your bond yields are at 7, 8, 9%, offers you enormous returns. So that will continue to be driven by quantitative easing, by the huge amount of liquidity that's being pumped in.